Thank you so much for coming to Christie's. We're so delighted tonight to have a preview of our May sales, mostly 21st century evening sale and some day sale. But most importantly, we are delighted to have with us tonight Fred Hoffman, scholar, historian, former dealer, what I don't know, so many hats you've worn over the years, and of course Alex Marshall, who is our post-war contemporary specialist here, and I can't say any more about you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Thanks, Sonia.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Is this working? Okay, it is. We are here. Thank you, Fred, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us. We are here to discuss two works by Jean-Michel Basquiat. The portrait of the artist as a young derelict, which unfortunately is not present tonight because of some logistical issues, but it is on the screen behind us. And of course, this beautiful sculpture, C Plate 3, which was both were executed in 1982 and exhibited at the now historic Fun Gallery. I want to start the conversation off with, this multi-panel painting is one of his most complex works of Basquiat, and an iconic work. And I think both in its composition and in the way it's made is amazing. And I think maybe you could talk to us a little bit about both the material composition and both physically and in terms of subjects.
Sure. First, I would say that so the painting, which you're seeing on the screen, is about maybe a third bigger than the screen. So, just to put a little bit of context, it's not some humongous 10-foot painting, but it's substantial in size. It was painted in the fall of 1982 for Jean-Michel Basquiat's exhibition at the Fun Gallery in the East Village, which ran from November to December 1982. And this work, which in my mind is the accompanying work for the painting, which we'll get into why it is the accompanying work, was also included in that show. For many of us, me included, this was probably Basquiat's most important exhibition during his lifetime. He showed here in Los Angeles some extraordinary exhibitions in West Hollywood with Larry Gagosian, showed with Bruno Bischofberger in Zurich, showed with Mary Boone, and Anita Nozay in was his first show in New York. But this show really, really was a defining moment for the artist, and he included quite a number of really important paintings in this exhibition. From my perspective, this was not only the most important painting in that exhibition, but this is one of the most important paintings in Jean-Michel Basquiat's oeuvre. It's really for me, a defining painting. It's structurally and compositionally very complex. It has a rich iconography, and it has a multi-layered subject matter, which includes many references to his own identity, his sense of himself, as well as a real important in defining commentary on the cultural milieu of New York, both downtown New York specifically and the art world in New York in general. The painting was constructed, it's a little hard to tell, but if you look carefully, you'll probably get the gist of it, from 10 separate wood surfaces. All of the different materials used to construct this painting had a previous life as some form of building material or just found on the street. So in a sense, the work comes into the studio from the street. It's very, as you can see, it's a very unusual shape, very specifically constructed. It is held together both on the front and the back. If you look carefully, it's a little hard to tell, but sort of take my word for it. There's a long hinge down the center of the painting, a metal hinge. And if you look in the upper left, you'll see two strips, which are actually small hinges. And those are partially holding the work together, giving the appearance that the work is basically, held together somewhat sufficiently, but maybe sort of alluding to something that's a bit precarious also. This is an image that I asked them to make available. This is, usually we wouldn't do this in dealing with contemporary art, but it's rather interesting here. This is the back of the painting. And you can see that, really get a further sense of how it's composed and held together with these long window hinges that run down from top to bottom in two places, and then all these wood slats that going across. So,
beyond
yeah.
the physical construction of it, or within that, did Basquiat have any intent in terms of the form and the shape?
Yeah, good, thank you, good question. Okay, so this painting, many of the other paintings included in the Fun Gallery exhibition and other paintings that he executed in this period of 1982 seem to be constructed rather flimsily. Oftentimes, 82 paintings would have the canvas literally wrapped over the wood slats holding the painting together, and oftentimes the wood slats are open and exposed at the corners and tied together with twine, giving the appearance that this is something, how can this be? And clearly Basquiat was playing with his audience. You're used to such traditional picture supports, try this on. And this painting plays with that same, it's not really so much a fuck you attitude, but it is sort of, challenging the audience. But this most of the other paintings that he made in this period, which have these flimsily constructed picture supports, basically conform to a regular rectilinear shape. As you can see here, this painting is hardly that. It has a very irregular shape. And as I've written about and other people have written, this is very intended, very specific. This work was systematically conceived and systematically executed with the intent of linking this work to an established pictorial tradition, that of the Renaissance altarpiece, which you might say, God, I never thought of Basquiat thinking about the Renaissance, but Basquiat was a great consumer of source material and understood so quickly and thoroughly the implications of what he was doing and what other people had done. And Basquiat turned to the reference of a Renaissance altarpiece specifically with the intent of trying to infuse in this contemporary artwork a votive function. He wanted his work, just like the Renaissance altarpiece, if you walked into a church or cathedral and you approach a high altar, you do it with a great degree of submission and reverential feeling. And Basquiat wanted his painting, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Derelict, to be approached the same way. And it was for that reason that he made this specific reference to the Renaissance altarpiece.
And maybe we could talk a little bit about the composition of each panel.
Sure.
I know on the left panel you see a lot of graffiti. Is that?
Well, the way we have the slide deck, we start with the right panel.
All right. Let's start with the right panel then. The right panel has a portrait of an artist, or we can assume that it is a portrait of an artist, but from the title.
Given the title of the painting, portrait of the artist is a young derelict, which clearly references James Joyce's great novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Clearly, Basquiat is thinking of a portrait of the artist. As we get into it, you'll see that, in my mind, it's a little unclear if he's alluding to himself or someone else, or himself as well as another personage. The head depicted on the right panel of this work is possibly a self-portrait of the artist. That said, it doesn't really resemble any of Jean-Michel's physical characteristics. Other self-portraits from 1982, there's about 14 self-portraits from this period time. I've just given a whole lecture on self-portraiture, so it's sort of interesting to me. Some of the other ones have specific references in the physiognomy, especially the hair, that make it clear that Basquiat was thinking of himself. This is possibly a self-portrait of Jean-Michel. Given his titling of the painting, I think that's reasonable to assume that it's probably a reference to Jean-Michel Basquiat.
I don't know which is the next slide. If it's the middle one, maybe we can.
We'll go to the left.
To the left. All right, great. So now this graffiti on the left, is this? I mean, it's well known that Basquiat started off his career as a graffiti artist. Samo, he went by Samo. Is the S on the left? Is that a symbol for Samo? Is that?
Well, you asked me that before. I hadn't thought about that in any of the previous writing I've done on this painting. I've never specifically thought that Basquiat was alluding to himself as the tagger Samo by this shape. For my mind, the S, it's actually, there's two of them actually in the painting. There's actually three. It's a double S, and it is a symbol that is identified more generally with graffiti culture. And you'll find other graffitiists that will use that same shape. And for my mind, Basquiat, the left panel is Basquiat's shout out to hip hop culture, to graffiti culture. And he does it in a number of ways. For one, as we've noted, actually I'm going to go back in a second, but I'll finish what I was going to say. The materials used in this panel had a previous life on the street. And if you look very carefully, you'd have to get right on top of the image. There's actually signs of the material in the upper left of it having been tagged previously. So this clearly had a previous life in graffiti culture. So in two ways, Basquiat's alluding to hip-hop culture and graffiti culture. Keep in mind that this painting was executed 18 months after he basically stopped working on the streets under the name of Samo and had a full-on studio practice. Basquiat, by this point, clearly is thinking of himself primarily in the context as a studio artist who's taking on and challenging the other great masters of modern contemporary art. I just want to go back because it's sort of interesting. I think I can do that, because I forgot to do this before. You'll notice that in the center, it's clear that two of these materials, actually on the right and the left, both of these were objects that had functional use in their prior existence. It's clearly a door in the center, and on the right is a window he's covered over. So, taking materials from the street and bringing them into the studio and changing the meaning of the work, their meaning. So now we're ready to go to the right. Oh, the center.
The center, yeah. The panel is it's maybe one of the more complex compositions on the painting. There's this great charcoal passage in the background with the chalk on it, or the oil that looks like chalk. What is that reference to? And of course the street culture has a connotation for the underground, and I think you've mentioned that before in the past talks.
Well, this in contrast to the left panel, which is more as a general shout out to graffiti culture, this central panel is referencing a very specific aspect of graffiti culture, and it specifically is referencing the work that Keith Haring did in the subways in New York City. They're called Keith Haring's chalk drawings. And over about 2 or 3 year period, Keith Haring executed approximately 500 white chalk drawings on the black paper placards that were used to cover over advertisements on the sides of the New York City subways. Keith Haring went down into the subways during daylight hours at great risk to himself and executed approximately 500 works that are called his graffiti drawings. And specifically, so Basquiat putting white images against a black or charcoal background was his way of alluding to Keith's subway drawings. He goes further in these allusions to Keith by actually calling out the nature of Keith's activity, which was in part something undertaken with great risk. And he does that in a number of ways. You can see above the crown in the center, you'll see 2 ankle forelegs, and then below that you'll see the word ankle written 3 times. And so I've written, I think it's probably accurate, this was Jean-Michel's way of suggesting or tying the work to sort of a phrase that was commonly used on the street to break an ankle, which sort of implied getting ahead of someone else, making a move on somebody else, getting around them, and leaving them sort of standing in their own feet. And this was his way of sort of alluding to Keith having undertaken these activities in the subways and succeeded. And then, yeah.
Interestingly enough, this was first owned by Keith Haring, this sculpture.
Yeah, well, I would.
We're going to get to
I
that. Sorry,
get
okay. Jumping ahead. Unless you want to add anything.
Well, yeah, there's a couple other things if you're interested. I mean, he references another way Keith's subway drawings and in art in general with the reference of salt at the bottom, which calls up the notion of commodity in value. I mean, salt was something that was traded over, thousands of years, and it was Jean-Michel's way, used it in other works as well, as a way of referencing, sort of questioning this notion of value. Keith's subway drawings are on the placards in the subways. What kind of value do they have? Which, interestingly, over the years, the one body of work that the Keith Haring Foundation has found difficult to include in the process of authentication are Keith's subway drawings, because unless you have photo documentation of him actually making them, it's anybody's guess if it's real or not. And so they've just stayed away. So the whole question of value is brought into play. And then returning to this whole notion of the heroic act, he alludes to that a little further in a couple of ways, with the reference including the word morte and the cross, sort of implying that the works of the graffitists were done at great risk, even with the possibility of death. And in that regard, the work is really interesting as it prophesizes the death of another graffitiist, a man named Michael Stewart, who died 18 months after, a fellow graffitiist, who died after being apprehended by the New York Police Department, taken into custody while he was doing graffiti actions, and died in police custody. It was a moment that completely shattered members of the downtown culture, and Basquiat was like, beside himself, trying to saying repeatedly, this could have been me.
So this is kind of turning them into martyrs in this vein of this reflecting an altarpiece, is that?
Exactly. And then this is this wonderful photograph of Keith doing a subway drawing and getting taken in by the police. And you can actually find the whole video from the news feed on the internet, on YouTube. It's really quite nice. It's like a 2-minute video. And in terms of what Alex was saying about martyrs, yeah, so Basquiat basically doesn't look at himself or his colleagues as derelicts. He looks at himself and his colleagues as heroes, as martyrs, who have taken on the system and prevailed. And he makes a very specific reference to that, which is in the painting and below the head in that rectangle crossed out, and also depicted here on 2 of the 4 sides is an inscription. It's in a Latin inscription, Hic est Rex, which is the Latin for the phrase, "Here is the King of the Jews." And this comes from the book of Luke in the New Testament, and it used to reference, well, that phrase was put upon Christ's head after he was nailed to the cross by the Romans. And so Basquiat is specifically in both of these works and referring to this act of martyrdom and looking at he and his colleagues as martyrs. And so then it ties back to a point Alex is making, that in a way, if this is the high altarpiece in the painting Portrait of the Artist is the Young Derelict, this is the portable shrine. And I think Basquiat thought of it very specifically that way. And interestingly, after the exhibition at the Fund Gallery, Portrait of the Artist, the Young Derelict was sold during the exhibition. Back in the 80s, everybody wanted paintings. If you wanted Basquiat, you wanted a painting. Works on paper didn't get collected hardly at all. And this object probably got passed over. Fortunately, got passed over, went back to Basquiat's studio, at which time Keith Haring acquired it for his own collection, placed it in his living room where it remained for the duration of his life, right out in front of the dual portrait of Keith and his lover, Tae-Sung Shi, who actually took this wonderful photograph.
You've written and spoken extensively about Basquiat as a self-portrait, and this painting references the artist as a young derelict. In your mind, is this a portrait of himself, or is it just a composition of other kind of
I think it's both. I think he's alluding to himself in the portrait on the right and alluding to other members of the graffiti culture in the other, and specifically Keith Haring. So I think it's a combination. It's not a standalone self-portrait like some of his other self-portraits, which there's a wonderful portrait owned by an LA collector called Self-Portrait as a Heel, which is actually titled, that's the title of the work. And it's very clear that that's a portrait of Jean-Michel Basquiat. The hair looks exactly like Jean-Michel's hair. The hair in this particular work doesn't not recall, to me at least, Jean-Michel Basquiat. But it's either a portrait of Jean-Michel or of an iconic figure of a young black male. But Jean-Michel was a young black male, so I think it's fair to assume, given the title of the painting, that this painting is a specific reference to himself. And it's included in the discussion of other self-portraits. My talk recently, I wrote about it as a self-portrait.
Well, unless there's anything else you wanted to add.
I don't know. I said a few things.
I think you said a few things there about this beautiful painting. And
anybody there's questions though if you want. Sure.
Why does it say sarcophagus in the position?
Oh, you didn't have to ask that. I've been the first to admit that I have not decoded every phrase in text that Jean-Michel Basquiat's written. There's countless, and I have never even I mean, I've obviously given a lot of thought to this, and I have not taken that one on. Head of a friar, but okay, so the friar is a religious figure, and I think he was alluding again to this, my contextualizing this as a votive altarpiece, and so wanted to back up that reference by, and Basquiat was very playful. He's not going to be like one-to-one and super literal. I mean, that would be awfully easy and boring. So I think that Head of a Friar plays with it. Interesting, though, from the time of this painting, this going out into the world, until we did the retrospective at MoCA in 2006, this object was called Head of a Friar. And during the opening, I installed the show. I was the curator, and I was installing the show. The box and the base were separate. And I noticed on one of the inside faces, in quotation marks, the word C Plate 3. So I called it to the attention of everybody that this painting basically has been mistitled for 30 years. So it's now being properly titled C Plate 3. And God only knows why it's C Plate 3, except Basquiat was always fascinated with Leonardo and anatomical studies, and so indirectly I think that was what he was thinking of there.
Any other questions?
Okay, well, if you stand up, it's a good question. So the top image is a Skelly board. Skelly was a game, it's a street game that is played in urban environments, primarily in New York City. It's a game where you move from one part to the other. And Basquiat used a Skelly board in many early paintings, early meaning 1980, 81 paintings that were cityscapes. Basically, some of Basquiat's most interesting and important earliest paintings, before he really focused on figurative subjects, did not a lot, but some really extraordinary cityscape paintings, and often they included a Skelly board in it. So this is a reference to that, the street. It's taking the work back to the street. So in the same way that the materials take us back to the street there, he's doing it through the Skelly board here. No, it's canvas. This box is canvas. It's wrapped canvas.
Very light. Surprisingly light.
It's in great shape. Which painting in the Broad are you thinking of that has the hinges? Yeah. Yeah. There's several paintings from 1982, 83 that have the hinges on them. And I mean, in my mind, the hinges were never really done for, support. They're not weight-bearing hinges, but they do create a greater immediacy for what's depicted on the picture support and brings it back to the here and now. It's sort of like, Picasso using collage. I mean, it flattens out the image and brings you back to the picture surface, and so it creates a more immediacy between the viewer and the audience. I'd have to go look. I'm not visualizing which of the Broad pictures has it, but I think I might know which one it does. Yeah, and that, the hinges were, basically bought at hardware stores. Yeah. No. I haven't yet to see a Basquiat where the original hinges were part of the construction. I did. Yeah, I think a few different places in my book. And I've written a lot about Rauschenberg as an important source for Basquiat. And the assemblage aspect is, very rich. I've written about it also I wrote an extensive piece on a painting that came up at Sotheby's maybe 10 years ago, Yellow Tar and Feather, which actually has feathers in it. And, so Basquiat was very, very interested and versed in assemblage. Yeah, and had a very full, deep understanding of art history. I knew exactly what he was, who he was referring to and how. The what? Oh, no. That was who? She did that? The question was to talk about the show at the Orlando Museum of Art. There's an exhibition at the Orlando Museum right now. They can't have this on video, but that raises a lot of questions. And I'm not going to go any further. I've kept away from making any commentary on authenticity of works by Jean-Michel Basquiat since the committee for the authentication was disbanded, which I was a part of. Ever since then, I've kept my mouth shut.
What was your relationship with him, and how much time did he spend out here?
Okay, so Jean-Michel Basquiat first came to Los Angeles to open his first show with Larry Gagosian in April of 1982. In November of 1982, Jean-Michel came back to Los Angeles at Larry's invitation, and Jean-Michel took up residency on the ground floor of Larry's townhouse on Market Street in Venice. The ground floor was a full art gallery, set up as a gallery with a residential quarters. And he gave it over to Jean-Michel. Within about a week of his arrival, Larry called me and asked me if I would come meet with Jean-Michel with the idea that I and Jean-Michel would possibly collaborate on the production of a work in the silkscreen medium. And I had this new fledgling print publishing business, and Jean-Michel and I immediately hit it off. We ended up making 7 prints, and then I helped him produce a whole group of paintings using silkscreen techniques. And so Jean-Michel is not very well known because most people just don't, in New York, don't really want to give it proper consideration. But Jean-Michel resided on and off in Los Angeles from November '82 through the middle of 1984. So given his life as an artist, as a studio artist, was from 1981 through 1988, firstly, 2 of those 8 years were here in Los Angeles. And he made countless works of art here and felt very comfortable working here. And he and I had a really involved working relationship. Our son is named Jean-Michel. And I was involved with Jean-Michel in the production of his art, and when I sort of revisited my art historical past, I have a PhD and I sort of left it, abandoned it, and I wrote the catalog essay for the show at Brooklyn and Mocha. I realized that I had basically a new life ahead of me of writing and working as a scholar on Jean-Michel, and I've been doing a lot of that.
And in fact, Fred has written a great essay that you could read about this work in particular, but many others, in the art of Jean-Michel Basquiat.
Right, thank you. Yeah, so I've written a book. I've written 3 books. The last one is called The Art of Jean-Michel Basquiat. You could buy it if you choose to. It's available through Amazon or Arcana, but probably an equally good option is to go on my website, fredhoffmanfineart.com, where you can read it for free. The entire book, everything I've written on Basquiat's on my website. And it's I mean, you have to sort of blow it up to read it, but it's doable.
All right, well, unless there's any other questions, I think, thank you, Fred. Oh, yes.
That's not like
Next week.
So next week, there's a large Basquiat exhibition opening in New York City, which possibly is coming to Los Angeles in 2023. The estate of Jean-Michel Basquiat, primarily his 2 sisters, have produced an exhibition which will include approximately 200 works, all from the collection of the estate. And it's a very high production exhibition with immersive installations. One thing I'm looking forward to is Basquiat created these amazing paintings for the Palladium nightclub in New York in 1985. It's called the Michael Todd Room. And there are many attempts by dealers approaching me to try to get this as an exhibition. Anyway, they've recreated this entire space in this exhibition. And his studio, apparently. So that's a show that'll be great to see, either in New York or here. It's all from the estate. They've nothing else. Yeah.
I'm curious, did he enjoy or offer commentary about his painting? Did he discuss his works?
Yeah, it's a good point. You know, even though I've trained as an art historian, I hardly ever felt the need or urge to try to ask him or discuss with him what he was trying to do in his work. And I think it was in good part because watching him work was such an over-the-top experience that there was nothing to say, and just like, you know, and you knew there was a lot there. And I mean, you know, I know a few people that I think really sort of decoded and deciphered the works early on, a couple of collectors that I know. But no, I don't. I mean, I think it's taken time for the world to come to grips with his art.
But he himself, he didn't volunteer commentary.
No. There's one great video, great but ill-fated video of a professor trying to you can see it on the internet, trying to interview him, and it's just, it goes nowhere. I mean, so it turns out to be a complete disaster. But having said that, and I said this and I gave this talk a couple of weeks ago, the movie The Radiant Child, the documentary, feature documentary on Jean-Michel Basquiat, made by Tamara Davis, and in collaboration with her partner, Becky Johnston, which was primarily shot here in Los Angeles, both in Venice and at the Hermitage Hotel, has a fantastic documentation of Basquiat talking about his art.
You mentioned watching him was incredible. Can you describe a bit what that was like to watch him? What did he do that made it incredible?
He just was a whirlwind of energy. And one thing I can say is that, which I didn't say before, this painting, as you can see, based on what the comments about how it was constructed, he clearly knew where he wanted to go with this painting as he was building it. And I would go as far, he understood what the images were going to be, not that he specifically knew exactly which image and where it would go, but he knew this was going to be, you know, break down into 3 parts, et cetera. This is in contrast to the primary way in which Jean-Michel worked on canvases in the studio, which was an additive and subtractive process. He would put something down, and then he would oftentimes take it away, obliterate it. I mean, I saw Basquiat paint masterpieces, and you know, and then I'd fall asleep and wake up, and there would only be like a 6-inch segment of the original painting left, and he like took that 6-inch segment to then build up a whole new, you know, new painting. And he did that regularly. So, you know, he was a very actively engaged painter.
And how much of that did you feel like was intuitive, and how much do you feel like was
For him?
for him?
I think he knew exactly where he was going. I think he was willing to take chances, and I think he understood that one thing could lead to another thing, and he might not know what that other thing would be, but he knew that he knew to trust it, that it would lead to somewhere. And I think overall, he knew generally the theme and subject matter that he wanted to infuse in an artwork.
When I see these window paintings going up in the center of the painting, I think of Cy Twombly. Was he at all looking at Twombly, or is that just
Well, no, I think clearly he was aware of and thinking about Twombly. I don't think that in my mind, other people have written about Jean-Michel and have said how important Cy Twombly was for Basquiat. For me, more important for Basquiat was Rauschenberg and Andy Warhol. But Cy Twombly is clearly, and Dubuffet I think is an important artist for Basquiat. Cy Twombly was definitely someone that Basquiat gave consideration to. But I don't think he was trying to riff on Cy's work and try to, you know, start with Cy and see where he could take it.
I think unless there's
Great.
any
Well,
other
thank you.
questions, I want to say thank you, Fred.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Good.